So, welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I'm sorry about our little technical contretemps there, but everything seems to be working again now. So, thank you for joining. I'm Fiona Harvey, Environment Editor at The Guardian, and I'm going to be moderating this afternoon's webinar. We're going to hear, first of all, from Eli Mitchell-Larson and from Robert Sylvain about their paper that they've written on the difficulties with mitigation deterrence from pursuing carbon dioxide removal. It's an excellent paper. We're going to hear all about that first, and then we'll have a panel discussion afterwards. So I think the best thing to do is if we just get on with that presentation on the paper, and then you'll be able to ask questions in the discussion afterwards through the chat function and so on. Great. So if the authors of the paper could take it away, please. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Fiona. Good afternoon, everybody. So to kickstart the conversation, I think we will use a short presentation of how this paper was prepared and what there is inside. So let me share my screen to use some slide for this. There we go. Okay. I hope you're seeing my screen now. Yeah, so Carbon Gap is publishing this month a discussion paper on this topic of mitigation, deterrence, and carbon removal. And the title is How to Avoid Carbon Removal, Delaying Emission Reduction. So in the next 10 minutes, we will just give you a sense of why we prepared that paper and why we think it's timely, how we work to prepare it and how it is structured, and then give you a flavor of what are the main takeaways. So let's go. Okay. The slides are not working properly, not a problem. Yeah, so why this paper now and why do we think it's timely? So there is a variety of factors that make us think that it is relevant to put this piece out there now. First of all, you see the graph on the screen. You've probably seen that elsewhere. 2023 is a very particular year. Climate change is somehow going a little bit off track, which is very scary. So what it means is that we have no time to get things wrong. We need to get things right now. At the same time, emission reductions are dragging. We're not meeting the targets we have. So that means that any actual mitigation deterrence happening is a real problem because we are already doing a poor job on emission reductions. Simultaneously, carbon removal is growing and is reaching progressively a critical size, which means carbon removal is here and it's not anymore a niche topic. It's becoming a thing and with a critical size. So we need to make sure it is implemented rigorously. I would add that the public perception for this climate mitigation approaches is the climate perception is still low. I mean, there is still a lot of distrust on how these techniques may be used. And I would also add that towards the end of the year, COP28 is showing up, and we anticipate a lot of conversation to be around carbon removal and how it interacts with other climate targets. Just to put the context of this conversation in the paper, we mentioned that, of course, mitigation deterrence is not proper to carbon removal. It equally applies to other mitigation options, such as, for example, CCS or offsetting. But of course, it applies to carbon removal as well, which is why we put out this paper and reflection. And also to make it clear, in the paper and in our approach of this problem, we look at all the diversity of carbon removal approach. Carbon removal is diverse, and the mitigation deterrence risks are obviously different for techniques like afforestation or direct air capture, just because of the different costs, the different level of permanence and equivalence that may exist with some emissions. So yeah, a pressing topic, make or break moment. That's what we just discussed. Also, because we have identified that too often mitigation deterrence is treated as if it was a single thing. actually it is diverse. You have different origins and it can take different forms. So that's important to know. We identified the need to take the conversation to a practical level as well. I would say that too often people raise concern about mitigation deterrence, but then the next question is, of course, what can we do about it? And that's obviously with the aim of unlocking the current situation where mitigation deterrence is uncontrolled, and that in turn fuels fears that hinders the development of CDR. So just to say that the current situation is really not ideal, which is why we need to improve that. So how did we work? This paper is based on a literature review. We also conducted a roundtable with experts that have already worked on that question for many years. And the paper and our reflection was very much structured around 3 different use cases for carbon removal, which corresponds to the use cases proposed by the IPCC. And Robert will say more about this in a moment. And we come up with 12 solutions or approaches that are aimed at both reducing the incentives for mitigation deterrence and mitigate its impact. Some of the main takeaways of the paper: first of all, mitigation deterrence is a serious thing. It's probably deserved more attention than it is the case now, and it is currently not controlled. Mitigation deterrence has various origins and takes different forms. That's important when we discuss this topic to keep that in mind. Another main takeaway is that actually we can probably do something about mitigation deterrence. We cannot fully control it, but there are ways where we can really limit the possibilities for mitigation deterrence to happen. And just to highlight also that the solutions that are put forward probably go beyond just mitigation deterrence, but they overall contribute to a broader, rigorous deployment of CDR. So yeah, like multiple wins by implementing these solutions. I'll pass it over to Robert to dive a little bit deeper into the use case and the solutions.
Great. Switch the slide there. Yeah. So as Sylvain said, this is very much focused on real world examples and looking at how carbon removal is used and is planned to be used to be able to identify what the different corresponding risks are for mitigation deterrence and also who will be deterred, so to say. And this is the structure that we used, although it doesn't cover everything, and there is some overlap between these use cases. It's the one that the IPCC has for the 3 roles of carbon removal. The middle one being maybe the best known to reach net zero and balance any remaining CO2 emissions with removals. CDR has a very integral and core component of that. It's more a question about how much, but some emissions will need to be counterbalanced with carbon removal. And that's use case B here. And use case C would be to use CDR to bring temperatures back after an overshoot. And now we're basically certain to have a temperature overshoot where the carbon budget for staying within 1.5 degrees is almost depleted and it's most surely going to be overshot. And if we want to return temperatures back then to 1.5 or even lower, there would be a need to deploy hundreds of billions of tons or hundreds of gigatons of carbon removal, about 222 billion tons per 0.1 degrees that you would want to decrease it. And now we're headed towards 1.8 to, depending on sort of if countries reach their targets or they sharpen them or what happens. And then use case A is sort of deploying carbon removal now, which we argue is done for carbon removal to fulfill the 2 other use cases. So why do you buy carbon removal now or you put money in it? Well, it's to grow it from like an almost non-existent sector. It was a very, very nascent phenomena to become something that can help reach net zero and that can help reduce temperatures. But of course, while you do that, you do also remove carbon, and a scale up of CDR to gigaton levels by mid-century would also remove gigatons on the way there. So there is also in the kind of a use case of reducing CO2 in the atmosphere on the way. And while writing this paper, I think it's mainly 3 risks and also fears around these use cases and around mitigation deterrence that we see. One is that low integrity carbon removal solutions is used to offset fossil emissions. So, for example, a lot of oil companies had plans to continue to burn oil and just plant trees instead, and that you're taking carbon out of the long cycle and putting it back into the short cycle where it's not safely stored, and it's not equivalent. It's not the same thing to burn oil and to store it in trees. So that's something that a lot of people have been pointing at as a risk, and it's very valid. And the solution to that is being very strict with the like-for-like removal principle, meaning that the time sort of duration of storage need to be matched with the emission source. So if you have fossil emissions, you need to permanently store away that CO2. But short-lived emissions such as methane could be stored away for also a short time if you continuously offset them. Emissions from agriculture, like nitrous oxide, that's 100-year lifetime, could be stored in forestation, for example. So if you have the like-for-like removal principle, you avoid the risk that these low integrity removal solutions are used to offset fossil fuels. A second risk or fear is if it's like unnecessarily large volumes of CDR is used to compensate for emissions that are avoidable. Technically, all emissions are avoidable, but they might be extremely hard to abate or extremely expensive. And CDR, in some cases, might be the most the cheapest and the less resource intensive option. But you don't want to have a lock-in situation where, for example, a lot of consumers continue to drive their gasoline-powered cars and just use CDR because it's convenient, and have that kind of policy failure where you have unnecessary levels of CDR and use too much of it. Also, to some risk, depleting land, for example, that could be used for other things and other limited resources. So that's something that where the solution is to look at principles for when CDR is best used, and then looking at the sort of relative costs, the co-benefits, the resource use, the risks of both carbon removal, but also the alternative solution. So when it comes to aviation, you would compare carbon removal to creating synthetic electric fuels, for example. But that's something that there is a need for more research on and sort of more thinking on when exactly do you deploy carbon removal. And then I think maybe the biggest risk and the biggest fear, and now we can go to the next slide, is that future cheap carbon removal, or sort of the anticipation of future carbon removal, deters ambition on a near term. So that you're counting on a lot of carbon removal being available later on for you to reach your net zero target would be deeply irresponsible. So maybe a lot of companies are saying that, sure, we'll be net zero by 2050, but we're not going to worry too much about that because, yeah, carbon removal, yada, yada, we can just buy something later. And a key solution that we lift up in the paper to that is, well, you have to plan for a limited amount of CDR to be available. And the Science Based Target Initiative, for example, has ingrained that into their standard and saying that you have to do 90% emission reductions, and then you should assume that it's just going to be 10% for permanent carbon removal for the last ones. To some extent, that also extends to other solutions. So if you hope for clean hydrogen or something else, that would also be responsible not to reduce your emissions today because you hope for some technical solution tomorrow. And a really key thing to avoid this risk, but also other risks, is to have near-term emission reduction targets and think around carbon budgets. So there's a huge difference between waiting until 2045 to start reducing your emissions and maybe reaching your target 2050 and start reducing emissions now. Like the cumulative emissions emitted over that period is going to be much lower if you start now. And if you use a carbon budget, that becomes more evident for people. And another key solution that's been highlighted by many, both academia and also the industry, CDR industry itself, is to use separate targets for carbon removal and emission reductions, especially in the short to medium term. which ensures that you're not deploying CDR instead of emission reductions, but it also ensures that carbon removal is actually being deployed at all, because now it's at a very low scale. So starting that is also important, because otherwise it's not going to be available and we will miss net zero targets because of that. And that's also an important part. And removing obstacles for emission reductions is something that needs to be always ingrained in climate plans as well. So CDR doesn't become the only option. It should be easy for companies and individuals, for example, to take action on their emissions. And finally, there's a long paper with a lot of conclusions in it, but finally talking a little bit about countries and their long-term plans. There is some risk for companies to plan for an overshoot, so that they don't set ambitious target enough and hope for net negative emissions after the world sort of reaches net zero. And of course, the solution is to pressure countries to set ambitious targets. But one key thing that we lift out here is to allocate future responsibility to address overshoot. So basically agreeing on principles for who pays to reduce emissions. It can be designed in different ways. It could be that you have a responsibility for part of your historic emissions. And if we agree on that, and if countries see that the more we emit, the more we actually have to put back later on, then countries like Sweden, for example, where I'm from, that just recently lessened their efforts and are going to have higher emissions than was planned. That means higher cumulative emissions. Maybe something like that could act as a deterrence against that, so that you're actually on the line for your future emissions as well. But yeah, it's a complex issue, and as we see here, the risks are quite different from each other depending on what use case you talk about and sort of who you're talking about. And these solutions are also quite different. Some are very wide ranging, and others are sort of more simpler to implement. Doesn't cover everything, of course, and it goes also beyond the mitigation deterrence made of these solutions. Many of these are integral to climate plans in general. And we don't cover all mitigation deterrence. There are also forms that are more indirect. For example, sort of discourse around the silver bullet solution. Sort of if people think that, well, carbon removal is just going to fix it, I'll go and continue emitting, even if that's not sort of a direct mitigation deterrence, where they have a planning document where they say we're not gonna reduce our emissions. That kind of indirect discourse around silver bullets can also be harmful. But if these types of wide-ranging solutions are deployed, I think that helps against that as well. So I think this is something that we could have talked like a couple of hours about, and then having more of a seminar around, but as a very short introduction to this issue and to this paper, that will have to do for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. And I think you should all be able to see in the chat a link to the paper if you'd like to have a look at that paper now for yourselves. If you want to put questions in the Q&A and the chat, please do so. Any questions you'd like to put to our authors, and also to our panelists, because I'm just about to introduce them and they can react to this paper and what they've just heard. First of all, we're going to go to Kaisa Kosonen. Kaisa has worked for Greenpeace since 2002, and she is working currently on preparing for COP28, which is obviously going to be a massive event at which carbon dioxide removal will play quite a role. She also leads on the IPCC for Greenpeace, so she's got a great background in this. Kaisa, what do you make of what you've just heard?
Thanks, Fiona. Well, sorry. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting and important topic, and I'm very honored to join this panel. Having an adult conversation about CDR is hard because on one hand, yes, science shows that because of our carbon budget is rapidly shrinking, some level of carbon dioxide removal will be needed. And at the same time, often those who've been most keen to talk about carbon removals and marketizing them have been ones who never tried to stay within the budget in the first place. So that's where this report comes in very handy. It helps having adult conversations about the role of CDR in the context of serious climate action. And yes, there is definitely a concern within the civil society that reliance on future carbon removal could deter or delay urgent efforts to cut emissions right now, because it's not just a potential threat, it is happening, as we all know. There's an interesting report released by Carbon Market Watch just a couple of days ago, which looked at the role and implementation of carbon removals in climate policies across 20 jurisdictions around the world. And it found that while emission cuts should be the urgent priority, in most climate policy frameworks, carbon removals were undermining that principle. So in fact, not a single one of the regulatory frameworks they assessed was getting to grips with removals in a way that would deliver effective climate action and not undermine emission reductions. A sufficiently robust definition of carbon dioxide removals was missing, and we're lacking comprehensive, separate and legally binding targets. So it's hard to take plans that rely on CDR seriously when there are hardly any real-life examples of decision makers responsibly scaling up removal while maintaining urgency on emission reductions. But at least here, leaders are given the chance to do it, to responsibly scale up removal by following your 12-point checklist, but not by picking and choosing from it, like, oh, I support CDR today, that's what I can do, but to check the full list. And now, as Robert mentioned, it's a combination of recommendations that are rather easy to implement, like the recommendation 4, regulate climate-related claims. This is where the EU just last week took a helpful step forward with the Green Claims Directive that bans offsetting-based green product claims. And then there are those that will be very hard to implement, like the suggestion 11 to allocate future responsibility for CDR to address overshoot. Ideally, yes, but as we know, there has been very little appetite within the UNFCCC to allocate the remaining emission budget. So it is, of course, hard to see a pathway to countries agreeing on the allocations for CDR responsibility. But obviously, we can't just do the easy things. We'll have to tackle the more difficult questions too. Finally, when we're talking about the 12-point checklist, I couldn't help but think of the 12 steps program designed for anonymous alcoholics. And there, the first step is to admit that you have a problem. So here too, the first step is to admit the true scale and nature of the problem. So if we look at your first recommendation here, removing barriers, then the biggest barrier at the moment is the illusion that you could be fully committed to the Paris Agreement, but not agree to phase out fossil fuels. So we've had the Paris Agreement now with the 1.5 warming limit for 8 years, but none of the world's largest fossil fuel producers have even committed to ending new investments in oil and gas production, and instead are increasing them. So it's not like we tried everything and that didn't work, and so now we need a plan B. It's more like get serious with the plan A and realistic with the plan B. And that's indeed where I find this report to be a very helpful tool to advance an adult conversation on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those forthright words there, Kaiser. That's a very helpful intervention. Thank you. I'm going to move on now to Jori Rogel, who is Professor of Climate Science and Policy here in London at Imperial College. He's been author on several of the IPCC's reports and on the emissions gap report that's put out annually by UNEP. So, Jori, what have you heard from this new study that strikes you?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to speak on this panel. I think this is a really timely discussion. The question of mitigation deterrence through the CDR is one that is by now over a decade old, and it really stifles good progress in developing the contributions that we need. As it was highlighted and as research always shows, is that we are in it is crunch time. This decade and the decades to come, but starting this decade, it is crunch time. We need to start implementing measures that reduce emissions, and because we have waited until now, we basically need to implement all measures that are societally possible and desirable. And CDR is there on this border between desirable and undesirable always, and there are people pulling it in both directions. And so I just want to reflect a bit on what the science indeed says about CDR and what the latest IPCC report said about CDR. The latest Working Group 3 report found that any net zero system requires some degree of CDR. And so that tells us that we need to start thinking about a policy framework, about policies, about plans where CDR plays a role. Of course, the same report also highlights that the amount of CDR that we use, the types of CDR that we use, are very much not determined by the physics, but very much by the choices that we make. And therefore also they need to be informed by clear scientific information. And as was already highlighted in the beginning, CDR can either be used as a substitute to ongoing emissions that are either already reduced as much as they can, or are actually not reduced very ambitiously at all. And in that sense, CDR becomes a way to just mop up pollution that is emitted elsewhere. However, CDR, the same measure in combination with very ambitious emission reductions can provide a very positive contribution to an outcome that is as ambitious as possible, and also it does not only peak warming, but also slowly starts to reverse it. So what I hear from this report, which I think lays out the different aspects and the different challenges quite clear, I think there is one aspect that is very clear, and that any discussion or consideration of CDR in a mitigation strategy should come with a clear plan with near-term steps that can be tracked towards its achievement and towards the delivery of CDR. At the same time, I would say that from a mitigation perspective, one should maybe aim to scale it up, but not bet on it being efficient or effective. And like that, we can actually develop a climate resilient pathway, not just from the adaptation side, but also from the mitigation side.
Thank you very much for that. I hope you can hear me. Yes, we're going to move on now to our next panelist, and I will. Sorry, I'm not sure you can see me. I'm going to introduce Martin Juskra, who is policy advisor at the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland. He works on the development of carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal, which Switzerland views as necessary to meet its long-term climate targets. So, Martin, what is your experience? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you very much, Karen Gap, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share a bit the Swiss perspective. I'm going to take a little bit a different angle and provide you some insights into the Swiss climate strategy and climate law. And of course, we had to produce this strategy without having this report. And I would then leave it a bit also to the panel and the participants to judge on whether we have done a good job in addressing carbon mitigation. But at least when I was looking at this 12-point list, I refound some aspects of it quite a bit in our strategy. So thank you very much for having me. The Swiss people, they approved the climate law in a public referendum this June by quite a large majority of 60%, and the new climate law now constitutes the net zero target in the law by 2050. And this net zero target is actually further defined in the law in a way that it says that first the emissions need to be reduced as much as possible, and then only in a second paragraph, on a second level, the residual emissions need to be balanced by carbon dioxide removal. So this puts a clear hierarchy in the measures and the priority on the emission reduction. A second rail guard in the law is that it defines sectorial targets for different sectors, for mobility, buildings, and industry, and it also defines intermediate targets in the time between now and 2050. I would like to take one step back on what was kind of the basis that this law is based on, and I think there's two key elements. And one, it's the fundamentals, it's the facts and the data that were used, and then the second important point is a coherent strategy. On the fundamentals, there was a 1,000-page report really looking into the emissions of Switzerland, but at the same time also looking at the energy supply and looking at how the energy system transition can actually then also comply with this needs to decarbonize. And out of this report comes the need for CCS and also for CDR. And the second aspect I would like to, and this was then taken up by the long-term climate strategy of Switzerland, which took that into a strategy, as I said, and which defined the CDR demand and the CCS demand based on this data. And the second aspect I want to point out is a roadmap by the Federal Council, so this is the Swiss government, that was published last year, specifically on CDR and CCS, which shows the pathway to take to this, to achieve the CDR goals by 2050. And it also defines two separate phases, a pioneering phase from now up to 2030, where a lot of these questions that also Robert addressed can be further developed and addressed, and the targeted scaling phase up to between 2030 and 2050. So finally, maybe two quick reflections on the report. When I read it, I figured that on one reflection on point 7, which is only plan for limited amount of removal, Robert has elaborated a bit on it, and also Yuri. So on one hand, you cannot say yes to net zero without saying yes to carbon dioxide removals. And if there's a need for a certain amount for dioxide removals in the future, to me, this implies a responsibility to scale up these removals because they're not available today. And if you need them in the future, you're partly responsible to co-develop them with everyone else that needs them in the future. And that has to be reflected in your strategy. And second, I have maybe more a question, or when I looked at the 3 reasons of CDR that were laid out by the IPCC, I asked myself whether this mitigation deterrence effect is more pronounced or is equal among all 3 reasons, or whether there's some differences. And at least from reflecting from the Swiss strategy, at least for the short term, we have defined this pioneering phase where we don't put a strong effort in the removal, but focus on mitigation and on the scaling of the removal, and then only at a later stage come in with the removals. But I would be happy also to hear other panelists' reflections on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's a very useful intervention there. Right, I'm going to move on. We've heard from all of our panelists. We've heard about the report, so I'm going to move on to questions from the audience. Now, I see we have one from Tristan Copley-Smith that's directed at me, saying that the media erodes trust in carbon dioxide removal through the articles that we run. Well, I'm afraid you've misunderstood the role of the media. What we do is we report on these topics and we look into them in some detail. In some cases, we find that there's a great deal of, well, shall we say, dodginess, particularly if you look at the market, for instance, for carbon dioxide removals, many of which are not worth the paper they're written on. Sorry, carbon dioxide offsets, I should say, offsets, particularly in the form of deforestation offsets. So it's not the media that's eroding trust, it's the activities of very questionable people in this market, and they're the ones who are actually eroding trust here. We just report. That was one question. That was for me. We'll move on to questions that are for the other members of the panel. We can ask, how likely is it that governments can compel societies to reduce emissions if there is no agreement between the major emitting countries, principally China and the USA? Well, I mean, there is an agreement to reduce emissions between China and the USA. It's called the Paris Agreement. So I'm not quite sure what's meant by that question. Perhaps the questioner could ask that again in a clearer form. Right, what can we see here? What can communicators do to avoid perpetuating moral hazard in mitigation deterrence? Well, I'm not sure who would want to take that question on. Are there any of our panelists who want to answer that question? Can you raise your hand if so? Can't see that anyone has.
Oh, I can give a short
yeah,
response.
go for it. Go for it, Joey, go for it.
Without being a communication expert, but I think in terms of the communication and information I would like to receive in order to make an informed decision, I think that both the, let's call them necessity, the needs, and the challenges and the trade-offs need to be communicated together. And one aspect that also needs to be highlighted here, and it has been highlighted slightly in the introduction, is that carbon dioxide removal is not, it's a zoo of different options that is out there. And they're very much not the same in permanence, and that is well established, but they're also not the same in material or resource demands. They are not the same in potential trade-offs with other societal goals. And I think in our communication, and this is challenging, this is complex. So this means it's not just a simple one-line question, one-line message. So I think if in the communication also this diversity and the fact that not every carbon dioxide removal option is the same or is equally desirable, if that can also be communicated, I think that would at least help to make better informed decisions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We've got another question, which is why does the report not include a recommendation to exclude carbon dioxide removal from offsetting markets? Robert, I think you would like to answer this. Could you go ahead?
Yeah, so companies buying carbon removal credits to reach their net zero target, as long as those carbon removal credits have high integrity and don't have a lot of side effects, and also follow the like-for-like principle. So for your fossil emissions, it's permanent carbon removal, is a way to reach net zero, and is a way for companies to take part of their responsibility. So we're not taking a stance against well-functioning, high-quality offset markets in this report. So that is not to be conflated with sort of low-quality avoided emission offsets that have not lived up to their promise. And there is also an ideal scenario where companies are maybe just contributing to whatever is most effective. So I also work with a charitable fund where companies tax themselves based on their emissions, and they put money into the fund, and we support whatever climate solutions that we think help reach global net zero in the best way. I think something like that is an ideal scenario. So companies, the ideal thing for them maybe is not to reach their own net zero targets, but rather contribute where their money is needed the most. But now we live in a net zero paradigm. There's thousands of companies that have net zero targets, and them reaching them through buying carbon removal, I think it's perfectly justifiable as long as it sort of adheres to these principles. And there's actors like the Science Based Target, for example, that sets clear guidelines around the use also of carbon removal.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Is there any other panelists who'd like to come in on that question? Can you tell me?
I'd be happy to.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I think with companies and offsetting with companies, one needs to see keep in mind that we are trying to achieve a globally consistent transformation. And so ultimately, what a company needs to do, if they have operations that of which the scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions are producing emissions, under scope 1, 2, or 3, they are producing emissions, they need to make sure that those emissions go to zero, if not net zero. And no amount of offsetting will help us reach the goal. What offsetting can help is maybe, yes, create a market. It can help scale measures, but ultimately each company needs to get to very low levels, and most of them will get to net zero, if not net negative. So that should really not be lost out of sight. And again, if offsets are used in order to not reduce emissions at the operation site, I think that in the longer term, this can also lead to kind of a false impression of achievements if you really look at the big picture and the whole system.
There is a quick follow-up. When you say offsets, are you also thinking about direct air capture with permanent storage included in that? Things like that? Or are you referring to kind of more avoided emissions or the whole lot?
Yeah, it applies to both of them. The temporary storage has even more problems, but we all know that permanent or direct air capture and storage, even if it's permanent, there is only a limited amount of that we can do. If certain companies claim the capacity that we have as a get out of jail card to continue to not do the efforts they need to do in other areas, because they involve behavioral changes that we need, because they involve energy efficiency improvements that they need. This would be counterproductive in the long term. Now, in a rationally working world, companies that are willing to pay several hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to remove a ton of CO2 in permanent storage would also do the effort to try and reduce their emissions at the production site, but that is not necessarily a given.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that, of course, and some emissions might be cheaper to remove it to permanent removal. We'll see how that plays out. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question, which is in the discussion of the inclusion of carbon dioxide removal in the EU emissions trading scheme. How large is the risk of deterring mitigation by expanding the amount of emissions allowances? Sylvain, you would like to answer this question, is that right?
Yeah, I can try to provide a beginning of an answer. So, of course, this is a very important discussion, and also because it will be a very important step when finally carbon removal will be able to access compliance market to go to another scale. But yes, initially there is a high potential risk of mitigation deterrence, and the answer is really it depends how that would be done. So we are actively looking into this question, and a lot of other NGOs and organizations are really asking themselves this question, how that could be done properly. Because typically, for example, if you imagine a scenario where you would allow CDR, some sort of CDR, to plug into the ETS without changing the overall cap, that could have a direct mitigation deterrence effect. So what we are seeing is that probably either you allow this integration, but with very strict rules about what kind of carbon removal could be considered, what amounts of CDR could be injected into the market, what would be the changes that would be done in the ETS framework overall to make sure that this integration does not affect the ambition on the emission reductions, or you just don't do this integration and you consider other options, because of course it comes down to the initial intention with that integration. Why do we want to do this integration? Is it to allow the scale up of CDR providing a compliance market, in which case you can probably do that separately, or are there other objectives? So yes, there is a risk. It really depends on how that would be done, and that's why this is an important conversation that we need to keep an eye on, and at least Carbon Gap will be very active on this in the coming months. I don't know if any other panelists would like to add to this question.
Yeah, maybe I can add a bit of a conceptual perspective. So the EU ETS is one of few systems that it's actually net zero compatible. So you can kind of force this cap to zero and then it would be net zero compatible. But then if you look at certain industries that are in the ETS, for example, the cement industry, even if they employ CCS, they cannot go to zero emissions. There's always a little bit of residual emissions that go out of the stack, and if they have to go to net zero, they have to compensate it. So I think I just can comment on what you said. It's all about the rules you implement. So it needs to be a like for like approach. It needs to be long-term removals, and then how much you allow into the system, not having to that you don't have mitigation deterrence. If you look at the current prices now, CCS would still be much more cheap than, for example, direct air capture with permanent storage, just because the CO2 concentrations in the smokestack are 20 or 10%, and in the air it's 0.4 per mil. So if you do it right, I think the risk for mitigation deterrence is not very high.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We've got another question, which is if carbon... Yes?
Maybe you didn't see my hand, but can I also say something on
this? No, I can't see anyone's hands. I'm sorry. Okay. Carry on.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, yes, on this question of upcoming EU legislation, yes, as discussed earlier, like-to-like principle is very important, and having separate targets for emission reductions and carbon removal uptakes. But I would also want to bring another aspect, which is that the EU is currently struggling with the existing carbon removal target it has, which is the LULUCF target, LULUCF obligation. So making sure that the carbon sinks and removal rates you have are going to the right direction. So we actually have a problem here in Finland, where on one hand, on paper, we're in a very exciting situation where we have a carbon or climate neutrality by 2035 target. It is established in climate law, and we are also one of the first countries that has legislated the fact that after 2035 we need to become climate negative. So all good until that point. And in our emission reduction, emission trading sector, so in energy production and industry, the emissions are going down. But because the net sink has collapsed, as a net result, our emissions haven't reduced at all from 1990. And currently we have a new government who now wants to talk about, tapping emissions from biomass plants and pulp mills. So we're talking about BECCS or BECCU, which is in principle a good idea, but it can't be used to avoid the action we need to take now to take care of our existing carbon sinks or carbon removals. So this in the EU legislation needs to be taken into account as well, that we can't just hope that something will come in 10 years from now. We need to also take care of the existing carbon storage and sinks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kaiser. And actually, I'd like to keep you for the next question, which is that if CDR offsetting does cost less than the sort of last mile mitigation, is it okay to use the offsetting? Kaiser, could you hear that?
Sorry, I think I missed that.
If CDR offsetting costs less than the last mile mitigation, the kind of last bit of mitigation that you could do, is it okay to use the offsetting?
I think it's a quite theoretical discussion at the moment, right? Or are we in that
quite
situation?
Important as well. I mean, so at what point do you decide that you should stop trying to mitigate the emissions and start using CDR? Is it the point at which it's more expensive to do mitigation than CDR? Because if it's that point, then a lot depends on the price of CDR offsets.
Right. I think there's a good principle in one of the recommendations that this report is doing, is that because there is this discussion about, what are the hard to abate or impossible to abate sectors where we might need CDR. But there hasn't been much discussion or definitions of, when are you at the stage where you suggest that there are no options? Because of course, they're usually eventually either there can be options or they might there might be coming options. So getting into practical level on defining those sectors is going to be very important, and what is a sort of the limit beyond which they can go with other means. But yeah.
And who should do that? Who should put out that definition? Who should be in charge of saying that? Is it just up to individual companies, or should there be some kind of broader framework, do you think?
I think Eli has an idea, but I wouldn't count on high polluting industries themselves to regulate themselves out of the business. So we will need scientists and regulators.
Okay. Yeah, I think the voice of experience there from Greenpeace. Eli, would you like to come in on that point, actually?
Absolutely. Just to build on Kaisa's point, I think the question that was asked earlier, when do you stop trying to mitigate and eliminate emissions? Never. We should never stop trying to do that. And the definition of what is hard to abate will change on an annual basis as technologies change and our ability to pay changes. So what we have to do is recognize that we'll constantly be on a journey to absolute zero, right? Net zero is a waypoint on a longer journey to absolute zero. But to use the European context for a moment, which is where Carbon Gap works, there is a commitment in the EU to climate neutrality by 2050, which of course means net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and net zero CO2 emissions prior to 2050. And so if we've made that commitment, to Yori's point earlier, the amount of CDR we need is a direct result of the decisions that are made. And so there will be, we've already agreed as a union that there will be some emissions which are balanced with those higher durability permanent removals. And so in essence, whatever is left over as we approach that climate neutral deadline will have to be cleaned up with carbon removal. That doesn't mean that we'll then continue balancing those emissions with carbon removal in perpetuity. We'll at the same time still try to eliminate those emissions. But I think that's important to remember, that we have these dual goals of getting to absolute zero, but we can't let our quest for absolute zero get in the way of stopping devastating climate impacts, which we've attempted to do with a limited overshoot over 1.5.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we've answered all of the questions that I can see, either in the Q&A itself or live there now with our panel. So if there are any more, please alert me now. This has been a very useful discussion. There's an awful lot to be done in terms of educating the public on CDR, but also companies, governments, even sections of the science community and the NGO community certainly need to be educated on what happens with CDR. So I think that having this report is a really good step forward. I think this discussion today has also been really helpful. It's really obvious that we do need to talk a great deal more about carbon dioxide removals and their roles before we can get to some kind of common understanding around the world. So with that in mind, I'm going to give the last word in this webinar back to you, Eli, to sum up some of the points, not only in your excellent report, but also that have come out in the past hour of discussion. Please.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you so much to Fiona Harvey and to the panelists for this excellent conversation. We couldn't be more pleased. Thank you for joining. I think we wanted to close by re-anchoring on why we set out to create this paper. And I think that Kajsa's points about the difficulty of having an adult conversation on carbon removal were really well received, because that's exactly what we were trying to do. And really, the debate, as Yuri mentioned, on mitigation deterrence and the risk that carbon removal specifically poses towards mitigation deterrence, admitting that there are other climate solutions that can also potentially create that risk, has been going on for decades. And we perceived that that debate had reached essentially an impasse, a frozen point in which more actors were debating as to whether a risk of mitigation deterrence from carbon removal existed or whether it was relevant, than we're actually focusing on how to reduce it. So I think the point that Yuri highlighted, that net zero cannot be delivered without carbon removal. So the question is, how much carbon removal? And if we know we'll have to deliver it, then we need to be working today not to debate whether or how or where those risks of mitigation deterrence exist, but actually what practical solutions can policymakers like Martin and his colleagues in Switzerland and in the EU as well actually put in place that would reduce some of those risks. So we certainly intended this paper only as the beginning of a conversation. The solutions are intended to be applicable for policymakers, but ultimately, in no way have we definitively solved a challenge which has plagued policymakers for decades. What we are attempting to do only, and this is really the call to action, is to bring together not just the community that often debates, carbon management, carbon removal, but really all the actors engaged in climate policy to say, let's put to bed the question of whether we're concerned about mitigation deterrence from carbon removal. Let's agree that risk exists. Let's be realistic about what the different types of risks are and which ones we can reduce and which ones we can't. And then let's work together to put those policy support in place. And hopefully the solutions we presented will be helpful for doing that. So thank you very much. I think with that, we'll close the conversation for today, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.